Exile, child marriage, tragedy and triumph. The life of Christina of Denmark, Duchess of Milan and Lorraine had it all. Oh, and she's also famous as the girl who escaped Henry VIII while still a teenager, and was the subject of this famous portrait by Hans Holbein the Younger. A renowned beauty, she went on to make a marriage which Henry objected to, but you'll have to keep watching to find out why, and I think you'll enjoy an ironic chuckle when you discover what the problem was. I'll also be telling you which modern celebrity I think she bears an uncanny resemblance to, and you can let me know below if you see it too. This is History Calling, where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the past, and today I give you the life of Duchess Christina. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up, and if you like history content and want more, hit the subscribe button, tap the notification bell next to it, and switch on all notifications to find out every time I upload. If you'd like to access this video's subtitles, these can be turned on using the CC button on the video, and you also have the option of selecting which language you would like them to appear in. You can do this by pressing the little gear icon next to the CC button, opening up the auto translate option, and then selecting your preferred language. Pretty much all of them are available, and once you make your choice, the subtitles will appear in your chosen language. You can also follow me on Instagram using the link in the description box, and there's a link for my Patreon page down there as well. More on that at the end of the video. Christina was born in Denmark in late 1521 or early 1522 to King Christian II of Denmark, Norway and Sweden, and his wife Isabella of Austria. Isabella's mother was Joanna of Castile and Aragon, making little Christina the great niece of the then Queen of England, Katherine of Aragon, and her husband, Henry VIII. We'll come back to them a little later on. Christina was also a niece of Charles V of Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was her mother's brother, and had a bunch of other kings and queens as uncles and aunts on her mother's side too, some of whom I'll be talking about in this video. You're seeing just the blood relations here with the women given their married titles. Despite being a princess of Denmark, Christina, who you see on the far right here, was destined to spend incredibly little of her life there. Incidentally, if you recognise this picture, it's because it's often misidentified as an image of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's oldest children, including by the Yale Centre for British Art, and I'm pretty certain that in some former video I've used it as such as well, which is annoying. I only discovered the true identities of the sitters whilst researching this video, so apologies for my former error. But I digress. Let's get back to Christina. In 1523, the little princess's father, who from what I've read was a thoroughly unpleasant individual, was deposed in favour of his uncle Frederick I, and she, her parents, and her older brother and sister were forced to flee the country, with Christina destined never to return. They went to Isabella's family and lived largely off their charity for the next few years, while the exiled king and queen travelled Europe trying to drum up financial and military support to help restore Christian to his throne. Tragically, Queen Isabella fell ill and died in Ghent on the 19th of January 1526, aged just 24. After agreeing to pay off his substantial debts, her great-aunt Margaret of Austria, an exceptional woman of the age who was regent of the Low Countries and in whose household Anne Boleyn had briefly lived, managed to gain custody of the 3 royal children from King Christian and raised them herself in the palace of Malines until she too died on the 30th of November 1530 when Princess Christina was about 9. The regency of the Low Countries and the guardianship of Christina were now given by Charles V to his sister Mary of Austria, Dowager Queen of Hungary, who was still only in her mid-20s and who was of course also the sister of Christina's deceased mother. As for the ex-king of Denmark, Norway and Sweden, he spent a few expensive and fruitless years trying to regain his throne before being captured and imprisoned by his uncle Frederick I in 1531. He lived out the rest of his days in confinement in Skanderborg Castle and the Castle of Kalundborg before eventually dying in 1559. Christina's only brother, Prince John, died in 1532, aged 14, leaving just her and her older sister Dorothea. Despite their exiled status and the fate of their father, these girls were young, beautiful, well-connected and educated, and had claims on the thrones of Denmark, Sweden and Norway. They were therefore much sought after as brides, and as early as 1527 there had been interest from England in having Christina for the wife of Henry VIII's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond. However, Christina's family were not interested in a boy born out of wedlock and with no real claim on his father's throne. When Francesco Sforza, the sometime Duke of Milan, came knocking, though, he was more successful. Despite being about 27 years older than Christina and in a poor state of health with constant financial worries, the match was ultimately looked on with favour by the girl's imperial family as a way to gain better control over the Italian states. Dorothea was unavailable, as there were already plans in motion to marry her to the King of Scotland, which ultimately came to nothing, and so it was for Christina that a marriage treaty was signed on the 10th of June 1533, with the plan being for her to go to her husband right away and start cohabiting with him immediately. Her aunt Mary of Hungary was extremely unhappy about the situation and wrote as much to her brother Charles V in a letter dated the 25th of August, and which also gives us an early look into Christina's childhood personality. Mary said, "As for our said niece, I have no doubt that she will agree to whatever you please to wish, since she regards you as her lord and father, in whom she places absolute trust, and is ready to obey you as your very humble daughter and slave. The child is so good and willing, there will be no need for any persuasion on my part. But on the other hand, Monseigneur, since the words of the treaty clearly show that the marriage is to be consummated immediately, and she will have to take her departure without delay, I must point out that she is not yet old enough for this, being only 11 years and a half, and I hold that it would be contrary to the laws of God and reason to marry her at so tender an age. She is still quite a child, and whatever may be the custom in yonder country, you are exposing her to the risk of bearing a child at this tender age, and of losing both her life and that of her issue." Mary was quite right that the youngest age at which it was deemed permissible by the Church for a girl to marry and cohabit with her husband was 12, and she also objected to Christina and her sister being made to make what amounted to dynastic treaties at such a young age. Dorothea was over 12, but was, quote, very young of her age, according to her aunt. She added, too, that the consent of the girl's father should be obtained. Her brother Charles sent her back a terse reply. King Christian was as good as dead for all the use he was to his daughters, and the Duke of Milan was so decrepit anyway that he probably wouldn't be able to consummate the marriage. I have no idea if he really believed this, but I doubt it. He must have known the Duke would at least try to consummate the union, and there was every chance he would succeed. He wouldn't have been entering into a marriage and having the treaty specify that he would share a bed with Christina immediately if that hadn't been his intention. Charles's letter is therefore breathtakingly callous and shows his real attitude to his nieces. He might claim to love them like his own daughters, but all the health and legal objections his sister had raised were correct, and yet he just brushed them away. When it came down to it, Christina was nothing more than a pawn to be moved around the European Royal Marriage Board, and if it killed her, then so be it. Fortunately for the princess, her aunt was not so easily fobbed off, and she conspired to keep her from the marriage bed for a little longer. When the Duke's emissary arrived to escort Christina to her new husband, Mary stalled him by at first claiming she was ill, then saying she needed to attend business in other frontier towns. The emissary saw Christina and her sister, though, and said she was better looking than Dorothea and very lively. Mary did ultimately agree to a proxy wedding, which was performed on the 28th of September, but she refused to allow Christina to travel in autumn and winter and said she would not be leaving for Milan until the following February. In other words, after the child's 12th birthday. Christina was now the Duchess of Milan, and she signed herself as such in a brief and formulaic letter to her new husband in November, in which she expressed her excitement at starting their lives together. She finally left her aunt's custody on the 11th of March, 1534, and arrived in Milan at the start of May, having been met near the city by her husband. A letter written by one who saw her at Savoy during the journey and reported on her looks said she was as beautiful as the sun, and noted how much she had grown even just in the past 6 months. After a triumphant state entry into the city, she and Francesco were married in person on the 4th of May. The Duke seems to have treated his child Duchess well, spoiling her with beautiful possessions and hunting parties to amuse her, and fortunately she did not become pregnant by him. Her surviving letters to him indicate she had affection for him. She said she was always happy to write to him in her own hand, even when he told her that she didn't need to trouble herself so. But his health really was poor, and in late 1535, when his wife was still just 13, he died with Christina at his bedside. The young Dowager Duchess, who was now also the Lady of the City of Tortona as per the provisions set out in her marriage agreement, remained in Milan initially, while other marriages were quickly mooted for her by her powerful relations. These plans came to nothing, however, and in December 1536, Charles V ordered her to go to Pavia. There she stayed until late 1537, when she moved to Flanders, again at her uncle's request, visiting her sister Dorothea and her husband, the Count of Palatine, who had married in 1535, on the way. By the 10th of December, she was back in Brussels with her aunt, Mary of Hungary. At the time Christina was making her way back to Mary, over in England, her one-time great-uncle, Henry VIII, found himself once more without a wife, as his third queen, Jane Seymour, had died in October 1537, less than a fortnight after the birth of their son Prince Edward. Soon, the 46-year-old king was on the hunt for wife number 4, and among the many ladies he considered, one of his favourite contenders was the young and beautiful Duchess of Milan. Henry's interest in her may not have been of particular interest to Christina herself. He was, after all, just one of many suitors seeking her hand at this time, but it did result in some appraisals of her looks and charms written by English ambassadors in Flanders who saw her and reported back to the king and his chief minister Thomas Cromwell about her suitability as the next Queen of England. One, John Hutton, wrote the following account of her to Cromwell the day after she arrived back in Brussels. The Duchess of Milan arrived here yesterday. She is 16 years old, she may have been just shy of 16 actually, very tall, taller than the regent, meaning her aunt, of competent beauty, soft of speech, and gentle in countenance. She wears mourning after the manner of Italy. The stay between her and Duke Guillaume of Ravenstein, son and heir of the Duke of Cleves, is only to know the Emperor's pleasure. She is said to be both widow and maid, so perhaps her uncle was correct that the Duke of Milan was unable to consummate the marriage. One of the council here suggests that the king should marry her, and the Duke of Ravenstein the Lady Mary, meaning Henry's daughter, Princess Mary Tudor. She resembles one Mrs. Shelton that used to wait on Queen Anne. Mistress Shelton was a cousin of Anne Boleyn and briefly a mistress of Henry VIII. She commonly speaks French, but can Italian and High Almain, meaning German. That same day, Hutton wrote to Thomas Risley, who was Cromwell's secretary, and expressed his opinion of Christina's looks in even warmer tones and with more detail, saying that there is none in these parts for beauty of person and birth to be compared to the Duchess. She is not so pure white as the late Queen, whose soul God pardon, but she hath a singular good countenance, and when she chanceth to smile, there appeareth 2 pits in her cheeks and 1 in her chin, the which becometh her right excellently well. In another letter from February 1538, he noted that she spoke with a lisp, but it, quote, doth nothing misbecome her. Henry was seriously interested, and one of the reasons this interest is one of the better-known incidents in the Duchess's life is because he was so smitten that he sent his famous court painter Hans Holbein the Younger to paint her in March 1538. Hutton reported that Holbein had only 3 hours to make his preparatory sketches, but the artist, quote, hath showed himself to be master of that science, for it is very perfect. I promised you at the start of this video that I tell you which modern celebrity I think Christina looks like, and it's Holbein's picture in which I see the resemblance. So tell me, is it just me, or does Christina kind of look like Millie Bobby Brown, particularly when she's playing Eleven in Stranger Things? Answers in the comments section, please. Unfortunately for Henry, and perhaps luckily for Christina, though he loved the picture, the marriage negotiations stalled, in part because, despite the fact that he claimed that his marriage to Christina's great-aunt Katherine of Aragon had been invalid, that's not how the imperial royal family saw it. In their view, Christina was his great-niece, and as such a papal dispensation would be required for the pair to wed. The king had by now broken with the Catholic Church in Rome, however, and could not be induced to recognise its authority over him, which applying for such a dispensation would have done. And in any case, he was excommunicated in late 1538. Just to be clear, he'd been excommunicated before in 1535, but that had been suspended. Instead, as we know, he went on to marry Anne of Cleves at the beginning of 1540, only to dump her 6 months later for her lady-in-waiting Catherine Howard, to whom the job of being teen Queen of England went rather than to Christina. If you see my playlist on the 6 Wives of Henry VIII, you can gorge on videos about these women and all of Henry's other spouses. It's linked on screen and below for you. There is a famous story that Christina of Milan was not keen on the idea of marrying Henry VIII, and later in life said words to the effect that if she only had had 2 heads, one of them would have been at the disposal of the King of England, a sly reference to the executions of Anne Boleyn in 1536 and Catherine Howard in 1542. However, although there were rumours in 1538 that she had spoken ill of the king, she denied them, and the 2 heads quote appears to be apocryphal and cannot be dated to any earlier than the 17th century, long after Christina's death. Had she been ordered by her uncle Charles V to marry Henry, she would have done so. She was guilty, however, of nearly laughing out loud when Risley sang Henry's praises to her, telling her how gentle a man the king was, and really, given that they were speaking about a known wife-killer, who can blame her? As it was, though she would never be his queen, Henry's interest in her marital career wasn't over yet, for her second union caused him some embarrassment and led to complaints. The issue was the choice of groom, who was Francis, Duke of Bar, Marquis of Pont-à-Mousson, and son and heir of Antoine, Duke of Lorraine. After the negotiations with Henry and all the others who had wanted her failed, the 19-year-old Christina was married to this young man, who, unlike her first husband, was only about 4 years older than her, in July 1541. The problem was that Francis had once been pre-contracted to Anne of Cleves, and this pre-contract was one of the reasons Henry had given for the annulment of his marriage to Anne in July 1540. He therefore expressed surprise to the imperial ambassador in England, Eustace Chapuis, that Christina's marriage had taken place, saying, "I hold that Anne de Cleves is the real and legitimate wife of the said Marquis, for I myself have never seen or heard of any deed or authentic document breaking through their mutual marriage engagement, that being the chief reason and cause of my separation from her." Now, none of this was really true. Henry had been quite satisfied before he wed Anne that she wasn't already married, and his main reasons for leaving her seem to have been a lack of attraction towards her and an abundance of attraction towards Catherine Howard, but you can hear all about it in my video on whether Anne could ever have remarried, as it goes into the annulment in detail. The story is amusing though, as it just goes to show that there was no such thing as 6 degrees of separation in 16th century European royalty. Everyone pretty much knew or was related to everyone else. After her marriage to Francis, Christina, now Duchess of Bar and Marchioness of Pont-à-Mousson, moved to the Palace of Nancy in Lorraine with her new husband, and they seem to have been very happy together. Within a few months of their marriage, she wrote that, "My husband treats me so kindly and has such great affection for me that I am the happiest woman in the whole world." They made visits to other European courts together, and Christina comforted him when he and his father were forced by the French king to surrender the fortress town of Stenay, which you can see on this 17th century map, and which was a serious blow to the House of Lorraine. They also had several children. The first was a boy named Charles, born at Nancy in mid-February 1543, as was his little sister, Renee or Renata, who arrived in April the following year. Just 2 months later, Christina's father-in-law died, and she became the Duchess of Lorraine, in addition to her other titles. It wasn't to be long, though, before she found herself a dowager once more. Francis's health had been worrisome for some time, with frequent bouts of severe illness, and on the 12th of June, 1545, he died, aged just 27. Christina was now a 23-year-old widow with 2 young children and a third on the way. She was also, as per the instructions left in her husband's will, the regent of Lorraine until her son came of age. This was easier said than done, though. While she was personally popular with her toddler's people, she was the niece of the emperor, and there were plenty amongst Lorraine's political elite who didn't want this young woman from the imperial family ruling their duchy for the foreseeable future. Even as her husband lay dying and practically unconscious, he was supposedly made to agree, possibly unknowingly given that he was at death's door and likely had little idea what he was saying, that his brother Nicholas, Duke of Mercoeur, Bishop of Metz, could have a hand in the governance of Lorraine and the raising of his children. In early August, the Dowager Duchess agreed to be a joint regent with her brother-in-law, with her retaining real control and custody of her children, and her daughter Dorothea was born later that month. There were, of course, attempts to have her marry again, for she was still a valuable political asset who remained young, rich, and beautiful. But Christina was determined to stay a widow, and her device was a tower with doves flying around its barred windows and the motto, "A ruined tower, I give shelter to no birds." Over the next few years, her time was often taken up in visiting family and attending family events, such as the funeral of Claude of Guise at Joinville in 1550, and having relations to stay with her in return, who were entertained by things like masques, hunts, and dances. The French were constantly pressing on her son's territory, however, and on her rights as Regent of Lorraine, and in 1552 matters came to a head. Henry II of France had declared war on Christina's uncle, Charles V of Spain, and Christina found herself, her children, and Lorraine in the path of French aggression. Her relations were too distracted with their own problems to send her any help, and though she went in person to the French king and pled for pity and kindness from him, receiving assurances that Lorraine would not be invaded, all these promises came to naught that Easter, when the duchy was occupied by French troops with Henri at their head. It was a personal disaster for the Duchess. Though she received her guests, by which I mean invaders, at the Palace of Nancy with hospitality, and at first thought that all might be well, the very next day she was told that Henri was taking immediate custody of her 9-year-old son Charles, removing him from Lorraine to finish out his minority at the French court, and that she was no longer regent. She went and begged Henri on her knees to take everything but her boy, but he refused to relent, and the child was effectively taken hostage and removed from the city of Nancy under military guard the next day, as his mother and nobles stood by sobbing. Writing to her aunt Mary of Hungary, Christina related these events, telling the Dowager Queen of her extreme grief and distress, and that Henri had, quote, "carried off my son by force with a violence which could not have been greater if I had been a slave." He had also forced her council to swear to protect Lorraine against his, Henri's, enemies, garrisoned Nancy with French troops, and made Christina feel that she was, quote, little better than a slave, who was thinking of travelling to Balmont with her daughters as the French wanted her out of her son's palace. It was perhaps the low point of her life. Her second husband had left their son and Lorraine in her care, and through no fault of her own, she had lost them both. She left for Balmont within days, but when Henri showed up there too, she and her girls withdrew to her dower house at Deneuve for several months, at which point she became desperately ill and her life was feared for. She recovered though, but after Henri discovered she was plotting to have Nancy retaken by imperial forces, he ordered her out of Lorraine, and she and her girls moved to Alsace. They then moved around several different places in quick succession, but she was back in her old home of Brussels by early 1553. Christina was now in the midst of a long period of exile, which would last for 6 years. She was allowed to stay in touch with her son via letters, but not to retake custody of him, and of course she could not go back to Lorraine, despite being its duchess. Still only at the start of her 30s, she remained beautiful and desirable and received fresh marriage offers, all of which were refused. Perhaps even more interestingly, for those of us who like Tudor history, in 1555 she made a short visit of a few weeks to England. By this point, Mary I was on the throne and married to Christina's first cousin, Philip of Spain. Mary was, of course, a slightly more distant cousin too, as her mother was Christina's great-aunt. We don't know much about this visit, except that it seems to have been motivated by a desire on Philip's part to convince the Duchess to marry the Duke of Savoy, as Princess Elizabeth Tudor was refusing to take him. Christina returned to Brussels, as did Philip soon afterwards, and was present on the 25th of October 1555 at one of the abdications of her increasingly weary and infirm uncle, Charles V, who was gradually giving over his lands and titles to his son and other relations. The Spanish and the French made a truce in 1556, but her son was still kept by the French while she remained at Philip's court. That truce didn't last long, however, and when the war resumed, Philip went back to England in 1557 to get Mary's help in fighting it. Christina, along with Margaret of Austria, Duchess of Parma, was asked to visit the country again too, and according to a letter in the Venetian archives, Christina said, quote, that the cause of their ladyships' going was that on their return they might bring with them Madama Elizabeth of England, to give her for wife to the Duke of Savoy. As we know, this didn't happen, for the woman who would become known as the Virgin Queen never married, but it's interesting nonetheless to see how these two famous ladies' paths nearly crossed in 1557, though they didn't actually meet as Elizabeth was at her home at Hatfield House at the time. The following May, 1558, the long-awaited reunion between Christina and her now 15-year-old son was finally allowed by the French, and took place in the village of Marcoing in the north of France. This meeting was only to last a few days, but they would never be forcibly separated for such a long period again. That autumn, Christina was given the prestigious job of presiding over the peace negotiations between Spain and France, a sign of the regard she was held in by both sides and the confidence all had in her intelligence and diplomatic skills. She was also seen as not beholden to either the King of France or Spain, according to one English observer, Lord William Howard, writing a few months later, and this made her acceptable to both parties. Juxtaposed with these triumphs, however, were losses. In quick succession came the deaths of her aunt, the Dowager Queen Eleanor of France, in February 1558, her uncle, Charles V, that September, and her other aunt and second mother, Mary of Hungary, less than a month later. They were followed by Christina's cousin, Queen Mary I of England, in November, and in January 1559, her father, the long-since exiled Christian II, who she hadn't seen since she was a small child, also passed away. His claims on the thrones of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden descended to her childless sister, Dorothea, also recently widowed. Christina therefore attended a bevy of funerals and requiem masses, but life had to go on, and in January 1559 she met her son again for a few days before he returned to Paris to be married in Notre Dame Cathedral to the 11-year-old Princess Claude of France. His mother was not there, as she was still in mourning for her many recently deceased relatives, and because she was also presiding once again over the next round of peace talks, which came to a successful conclusion that Easter, constituting quite the feather in Christina's cap. Despite how well she had done, though, she was slighted by her cousin King Philip when he appointed his illegitimate half-sister, the Duchess of Parma, to be regent of the Low Countries later in 1559, instead of the Dowager Duchess of Lorraine. The appointment was deeply unpopular with the people, who much preferred Christina, as she was well known and liked there, but Philip was wary of her French connections now that her son was married to a French princess, and of her friendship with the Dutch House of Orange. Instead of managing the Low Countries, Christina therefore finally returned to Lorraine, where her son had taken up his birthright as Duke. Charles was still very young and not particularly apt at managing the affairs of Lorraine, and therefore relied heavily on Christina for advice and support, even leaving her as regent of the duchy when he returned to court in 1560 to visit his wife's brother, the young Francis II, and his wife, Mary, Queen of Scots. When King Francis suddenly died that December, Christina, along with her son, had the Dowager Queen Mary come to stay with them at Nancy the following May before her eventual return to Scotland. Christina was looking to become a queen now as well. As her sister had no children and was considered too old to bear any, the Dowager Duchess of Lorraine asked Dorothea to cede her claims on their father's thrones to her and her son. She did so, and by 1563, Christina was styling herself with both her birth and marital titles as follows. Christina, by the grace of God, Queen of Denmark, Sweden and Norway, Sovereign of the Goths, Vandals and Slavonians, Duchess of Schleswig, Dithmarsh, Lorraine, Bar and Milan, Countess of Oldenburg and Blamont, and Lady of Tortona. Christina, who had also become a grandmother that year when Princess Claude gave birth to a son, Henri, would never be queen of her father's lands in any meaningful way, however, despite occasional plans to invade and take them and talk of marriage alliances between the Danes or Swedes and her daughter Renee. In fact, in 1568, when Renee was married, it was to the Duke of Bavaria. Christina now settled into a life led mostly in Nancy and Danube, with her son, daughter-in-law Claude, and their increasing brood of children. Despite having suffered near fatal illnesses in 1564 and 1568, she defied expectations by recovering and continuing to help Charles manage his duchy. Tragically, though, Claude died in 1575, aged only 28, and after giving birth to twins. Other family events, though, were fortunately much happier. Christina's younger daughter, Dorothea, despite having been born with a disability which left her unable to walk, which it might be assumed would have put anyone off marrying her in this era, though I don't know if she never walked, wed Eric, Duke of Brunswick, at the end of that year. As the 1570s came to a close, though, Christina's thoughts turned towards a retirement, especially after another bout of serious illness in 1578, and she decided to move to Tortona, the city left to her so many decades earlier by her first husband. She arrived there in June 1579 and remained for the rest of her life, managing her city with prudence, earning the love and respect of its citizens, and receiving visits from her friends and family. Her cousin King Philip, despite their closeness earlier in life, had become increasingly distant and unpleasant in his later years, however, and eventually told her that Tortona was his, but that she could live there for the remainder of her days. She disputed this view of the matter, but there was nothing she could do about it, and she continued in the city. It was whilst on a trip to see her daughter Dorothea that she became fatally ill, and in December 1590 she died on the journey home at Alessandria, aged 68 or 69. Her body was taken to Nancy in Lorraine, where she was buried. It had been a remarkable life, and one which I hope you've enjoyed hearing about. From an exiled infant to a child bride, to the Duchess and Regent of Lorraine and the confidant of kings, Christina had seen it all, done it all, and met most of the famous figures of the age. Before I leave you, thank you as always to my fantastic patrons whose support helps me to keep creating these videos. If you'd like to join them and get some extra History Calling perks, check out the link in the description box below. Thank you too to those of you who support the channel using the thanks button underneath the videos. Your kindness is also much appreciated. Let me know in the comments section what impressed you most about Christina. And until next time, keep learning.